Welcome back. And if you're a UPSC aspirant or just really into modern Indian history, well, this deep dive is where things get interesting.
Yeah, picking up right where we left off.
Last time we touched on some pretty big stuff, right? But this time we're diving headfirst into the Indian Independence Act of 1947.
Monumental, to say the least.
It's like monumental
Yeah.
and complex. I mean, we know it ended British rule, but there's so much more to it.
Oh, there's so much more.
So it's like this act basically set the stage for everything that came after. It shaped the India we know today.
Shaped it, for sure.
So I guess what we need to understand is just how exactly it did all that.
Absolutely. And for all of you listening, resources like po1lias.com, those are going to be super helpful as you kind of dig deeper into all of this.
Yeah, for sure. But for now, we're going to break it down together.
Right. Okay, so think about it. You're talking about a nation on the verge of independence. It's huge. It's incredibly diverse, and there's a ton of anticipation.
Right, a lot of energy.
And this act, it wasn't just a symbolic changing of the guard.
Lowering one flag, raising another.
It was about creating two brand new countries, right? India and Pakistan.
Wow. Okay, so how logistically did that even happen? You're talking about dividing an entire government structure, right? Like, how do they actually pull this off?
So it's July 1947. The British Parliament, they enact this act. It officially comes into effect on August 15th, and it basically dissolves the existing Central Legislative Assembly.
Okay, go on.
And the Council of States, gone. It was like hitting a reset button.
Like a clean slate.
Exactly. And then the act empowered these newly formed constituent assemblies, one for India, one for Pakistan.
Got it.
And these assemblies, they had the authority to create their own constitutions, to chart their own course.
Wow. A lot of responsibility.
Huge responsibility. And in the meantime, the Government of India Act of 1935, it kind of served as this temporary framework for both dominions.
A temporary framework.
Like a placeholder.
Okay, so that makes sense. They're trying to maintain some sort of order.
Some semblance of order in this massive transition, yeah.
Right, but then who was actually in charge during all this? Like, who were the leaders steering these new nations?
Good question. So the act, it established this position, the Governor-General. And for each dominion, for Pakistan, the choice was clear. It was M.A. Jinnah.
Big figure in the movement.
Absolutely, a towering figure, really.
And what about India? Who was their Governor-General?
Well, India, they kept Lord Mountbatten.
The last viceroy.
The last viceroy of India, yeah.
That seems ironic. I mean, the guy who oversaw the dismantling of the British Raj, he's still a key player in the transition.
Right. It's kind of paradoxical.
Definitely paradoxical.
Yeah.
But one thing that caught my eye in the source material was this phrase, breakneck speed. They talk about how quickly everything is happening.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly a leisurely stroll, that's for sure.
So was all of this smooth sailing? I mean, you're talking about dividing a nation. There's bound to be some hiccups, right?
Well, to put it mildly, yeah. Here's where things get interesting and, frankly, a little bit heartbreaking. See, partition wasn't just about drawing lines on a map.
Right, not just lines on a map.
It involved millions of people being uprooted, having to redefine their identities. It created this massive wave of uncertainty and fear.
It must have been just incredibly unsettling for so many people.
Absolutely. And trying to rush through a process like that, while they may have thought it would help, it actually created a whole set of new challenges.
Just so the speed actually created more problems.
Well, one of the most glaring problems was the lack of any real robust transitional structures.
There was no plan for how to handle all of this complexity.
Not really. It was like trying to build a house in a hurricane.
Wow, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, it really was that chaotic.
So, I mean, did this lack of preparation have actual tangible consequences?
Absolutely. It added to the chaos, and in some cases, it led to some unimaginable violence.
Violence?
Like the Punjab massacre. Horrifying chapter.
That's right.
A stark reminder of what happens when you try to force these monumental shifts without any real planning. You just think about the confusion, the desperation.
The fear.
The fear. It was just a recipe for tragedy, and the scars of that period, they remain even today.
It's almost unbelievable that something so important could be handled so poorly. Like, you would think that they would have put more thought into it.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
But what were some of the specific flaws in the act itself, or maybe in the way it was carried out, that really made things worse? I mean, this document was supposed to bring about freedom, but it ended up being entangled with so much tragedy.
Right. You're hitting on a really crucial point, and it's what makes the Indian Independence Act so fascinating to study. It was a triumph, for sure, But it's also a story of unintended consequences.
A story of unintended consequences.
And we need to understand those consequences. Let's dig a little deeper, shall we? So one of the big things the Act really missed the mark on was population transfer.
It didn't lay out any clear directives for that.
Not really. Think about the scale. Millions of people suddenly finding themselves on the wrong side of these newly drawn borders.
And the Act didn't offer much guidance on how to handle that.
You can imagine the turmoil, right? It's not just about lines on a map. It's about real lives, real families being uprooted.
Right, real people having to make impossible decisions.
And that's where the human cost of partition becomes so tragically apparent. The Punjab massacre, the migrations, the stories of families being torn apart, it was all just amplified by this lack of foresight.
It's like they were so focused on the legal and political side of things that they forgot about the people.
You're right. It's like the practical realities on the ground just got overlooked. And that brings us to another point of contention, the Radcliffe line.
Okay, the Radcliffe line, yeah, that name rings a bell. Can you remind me what that was all about?
Sure. Imagine this guy, Cyril Radcliffe, a cartographer, and he's given this massive, monumental responsibility to draw a line that's going to divide this entire nation.
He was the one who drew the border between India and Pakistan.
Right, and he had very limited time, limited knowledge of the region and its social complexities, and ultimately his decisions had some pretty profound and often devastating consequences.
So the Radcliffe line, it wasn't just some abstract geographical marker. It literally cut through communities, families.
Absolutely. And the speed with which it was drawn, the lack of any real mechanisms for population transfer, it all added to the chaos. It was a recipe for disaster. People ended up on the wrong side overnight, their homes, their livelihoods, everything thrown into question.
It really highlights how these seemingly objective lines on a map can have such real and human consequences.
Well, then it makes you think.
It does. But thinking about the long-term impact of all this, did this sense of urgency, this need to get it done quickly, did that have consequences beyond the immediate chaos of the partition itself?
Oh, absolutely. The hasty nature of partition, it cast a long shadow, and you see it in the refugee crises, the ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan, even the disputes over Kashmir.
So many of the issues that the region is still grappling with today, they can be traced back to what happened in 1947.
It's all connected.
It's fascinating and a little unsettling how this one event could have such a lasting impact. But I want to shift gears for a second. What about the princely states? They weren't directly under British rule, right?
Good point. That's another layer to all of this. So the Act, it gave these princely states, and there were hundreds of them, scattered all over. It gave them a choice. They could join India or Pakistan, or they could even try to go it alone, choose independence.
Oh, wow. So it was kind of a free-for-all in the middle of all of this.
In a way, yeah. You had all these negotiations, power plays, all these rulers trying to figure out what was best for them. Some of them saw the benefits of joining India.
A larger nation, more resources.
Right. Others, though, they were hesitant. They wanted to hold on to their autonomy, their power, their traditions.
They didn't want to give up their independence.
Exactly. And integrating all of these states, especially the larger ones, it wasn't easy.
It wasn't always a peaceful process.
You're catching on quickly. It involved a lot of diplomacy, persuasion, and sometimes even the threat of force.
Wow. So you have this huge puzzle, right? All these pieces trying to come together or resisting coming together. It's an amazing story.
It really is.
But speaking of the bigger picture, what about leadership in all of this? We talked about the governors general, but what about their visions for these new nations?
Well, here's another interesting twist. Mountbatten, the Governor-General of India, he actually envisioned a shared Governor-General for both India and Pakistan.
Wait, hold on. One person leading two newly independent nations. That seems incredibly ambitious.
Ambitious is one word for it. He thought it would make the transition smoother, a more unified approach to all the challenges.
Makes sense on paper.
Yeah, but Jinnah, the Governor-General of Pakistan, he had other ideas.
Of course he did. He'd fought so hard for a separate nation. Sharing leadership probably wasn't high on his list of priorities.
He wanted Pakistan to have its own distinct identity, its own leadership, its own destiny. And this clash of visions, it added another layer of complexity to an already complex situation.
So it wasn't just about dividing up the land. It was about navigating these competing aspirations, different egos, political realities.
Absolutely. And it brings up a really important question. What lasting impact did this rushed and chaotic approach to partition have on the relationship between India and Pakistan. I mean, we see the tension even today.
It's a relationship that's been strained from the very beginning.
That's right. We've talked about the immediate fallout, but what about the deeper, more enduring consequences? How did this tumultuous birth shape the future of these two nations? That's where we really start to unpack the legacy of the Indian Independence Act. It's not just a historical document, it's a story that's still being written.
It's like the events of 1947 are still playing out, still shaping the region today.
You see it in the headlines, yeah, all the disputes, the mistrust.
Exactly. It's like the ghosts of the past are still lingering.
It's fascinating, right? How one event can just keep reverberating through history like that.
It really is.
The hasty partition, the lack of clear guidelines, those clashes of personalities, it all kind of contributed to this legacy of suspicion and animosity. And that's proven really hard to overcome.
So are you saying that the tensions we see today between India and Pakistan, that those were kind of baked in, at least in part, by the way the Indian Independence Act was implemented?
It's tough to say for sure, but yeah, in a way, the way it unfolded, the trauma, all the unresolved issues, they all cast a long shadow, and that shadow is still there.
Makes you wonder, what if things had gone differently? What if they had taken a more, I don't know, a more measured approach?
What if they had planned things out a bit better?
Yeah. Would it be different today? Would India and Pakistan have a different relationship?
That's the million-dollar question. You can't rewrite history, but it's an interesting thought experiment, right? Maybe a more gradual transition, a more humane approach. Maybe that would have led to a different outcome.
It's a good reminder that even these huge historical events, they're shaped by human choices, human actions, human failings. And those choices, they have consequences. Consequences that can last for generations.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to really understand this act, the Indian Independence Act, not just the successes, but also the tragedies. It's not just a dry chapter in a textbook. It's a story that's still being written.
It's a story that's still unfolding.
And especially for those of you preparing for the UPSC exams, it's not just about memorizing dates and facts.
It's about understanding the how and the why.
Exactly. You have to understand those long-term consequences, those unintended outcomes, the ripple effects. That's where the real learning is.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, seeing how everything is connected.
Right. And as you delve into this, don't forget about the people who lived through it all.
The human element.
Yeah, their stories, their experiences, they offer these incredible insights into the true cost of partition, but also the resilience, the resilience of the human spirit.
That's a great point. It's easy to get lost in the big narratives, but it's those individual stories that really bring history to life.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We've done some deep diving.
We have.
Yeah.
A deep dive into the Indian Independence Act.
One for the history books.
Definitely. And for all of you listening, remember, history is a conversation, not just a one-way lecture. So keep asking those questions, keep digging deeper, keep making those connections.
And for more context, don't forget to check out those resources we've mentioned, like PA01ILEPIAIS.com. That's a great place to start.
It's a great resource for those of you prepping for those exams. So until next time, keep those study sessions going. And remember, the past is never really past. It shapes who we are and the world we live in.